Hello everyone, I am Captain Joel Hood, United States Marine Corps representative at the Center for Law and Military Operations. Welcome to Battlefield Next, a podcast devoted to the application of the law to the future of armed conflict. Today we have the privilege of hosting Lieutenant Colonel Chris Franca. Lieutenant Colonel Franca is Staff Officer 01 to Head Operational Law, British Army. We also have the privilege of hosting Lieutenant Col Andy Farquhar, Army Legal Services, British Army, who is the Deputy Director of the Legal Center within the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. Gentlemen, welcome to Battlefield Next.
Thanks very much indeed, Joel. My name's Andy Farquhar, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Legal Centre at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Centre and School. I'm responsible for helping to run a very committed and hard-working team who punch well above their weight in terms of their size. We're not a very large legal centre organisation, but the directorates are four of them. There's the Leadership Centre, the Future Concepts Directorate, the Centre for Law and Military Operations, and the Training Development Directorate. And in my role as the Deputy Director here at the Legal Centre, we've been in our roles for about 18 months, and so Chris Franca and I thought it would be a really good idea to just put a few thoughts down out in the podcast to let everyone know how interoperability has been going and what we hope to have achieved over the last little while, and to explain what we think is important going forward over the next few years. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. So I am Lieutenant Colonel Chris Franca. As far as my role, I work directly for the Head of Operational Law, British Army, which is a one-star position. This position sits directly underneath the head of the Army Legal Services, which is the Director of Army Legal Services, or DALS, and this is a two-star position. So if you want to think of it in another way, this would be the UK's equivalent to the U.S. Army's TJAG, currently Lieutenant General Stuart Risch. In my position, I focus primarily on three pillars of work. I would say that I spend a lot of my time, perhaps the most of my time, furthering interoperability. And when I say that, I'm not trying to say that I'm trying to further interoperability just between the British Army and the U.S. Army, but it does look wider than that. But obviously, because of this podcast and because of my work with Andy, we do spend a lot of our time working together. And so I would say that we've progressed legal interoperability between the U.S. and the British Army.
Unfortunately for you.
Right. And some of the things that we're also looking at in terms of legal interoperability at the British Army, we're not just talking about military to military. We also look outside of the military. So, for example, we work very closely with the Ministry of Defense, or the MOD, as well as the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. So there are some initiatives there as well. So we're looking across government as well as kind of branching outside into the military to military aspect. The second pillar of work that I really focus on is training and education. And so that really looks at both internal to the Army Legal Services as well as external and to the British Army writ large. And then finally, we look at operational law doctrine, not just in the land domain, but we work with our sister services as well to kind of look at doctrine, help them update it, but review it as well from the Army perspective.
Awesome. That's great. And so in terms of just setting out what we're going to talk about today, we'll set out what the initial assessment was for interoperability about 18 months ago, 2 years ago when we took over our roles, and then go into a little bit of further detail of what we've done over the last little while and how we hope that it's lended our efforts to interoperability and pushing things along. So in terms of the initial assessment, it was something like out of Beautiful Minds, but written by a simpleton, i.e. me, down whiteboarding sessions and taking up several large walls of whiteboarding to lay out.
And he's not joking there. Literally walls of whiteboard.
Yeah, it was the only way that I could put my thoughts out. And essentially what that looked like was trying to get our arms around what was the foundational basis for interoperability, what worked, what didn't, what had after-action reviews produced by way of recommendations, and how could we actually structure our thoughts around a vision for interoperability. And so what that looked like was that my position within the Centre for Law and Military Operations, from what my role, it was increasingly difficult to see how we were going to be getting the interoperability vision. Ultimately, after all that assessment and whiteboarding, we came to the conclusion that we needed to link the exchange officer positions more strongly to the requirements that we were trying to get after with interoperability, the structural requirements of trying to tie the positions together more closely. So Chris's job and my job, we needed to be more synchronized so that we could conduct mutually supportive activity. And I say structural because it appeared to us that there was room to create more of a formal process between the positions and in terms of cohering the activity that we were doing. And we'll speak more about that activity a little bit later on. So essentially, we identified that there was minimal linkage between the two formal roles. There was a lot of training being conducted and education being conducted, but largely it wasn't really synchronized, and there wasn't an end state in mind when conducting that activity. So we then looked across the wider exchange officer footprint. So there's exchange officer roles at 3 Corps down in Fort Hood, and there's also an exchange officer position, a US exchange officer position at 3 Div in Bulford.
Right. And if I could just jump in right there, Andy. So, we talk about kind of how the need for this more formal structure. And just to be clear, prior to Andy and I kind of taking over our positions, that was it on the U.S. side and the U.K. side. It was Andy's position here in the U.S. and mine in the U.K., but no other position. So when we came in, there were these 2 new positions, the one that in Fort Hood and the one in Bulford, as Andy has mentioned. So what does that mean for us? Well, as part of our initial assessment, how do we bring these new positions into the fold, and how do we validate their worth? And so that, to me, I think, showed us that we did need to have that structure. We did need to increase the linkages to kind of get the word out, if you will, but really to kind of validate the positions, because we're always fighting. We're always fighting for the resources that we have, and we need to keep them. And we can't maximize those new positions unless we're all talking to each other.
Yeah, awesome. So in terms of how we put the interoperability sort of vision together, if you like, off the back of that whiteboarding session, I ruthlessly stole an idea from the US Army People's Strategy, which had a really good one-pager in terms of ends, ways, and means. It looked visually clear and striking, and so I thought if I could use that framework to start to put down interoperability related subject matter, we could actually put something together that was clear, looked good, you can communicate that to people. And so what we really developed was an ends, ways, and means for interoperability, and the vision for the end state being indisputable allies, modernized and ready to deploy, fight and win against the full spectrum of threats around the world. And so that's really what we're after. The end state would be that when we deploy on operations as a coalition, we are able to dispense our legal advice to operational commanders to enable their operational effectiveness. And in a sense, the end state would be theoretical, which would be that a British Army officer could provide a legal advice to a US divisional or corps commander on the basis of US interpretations of international law and US policy, national law positions. And so whilst that is sort of the perfect end state, that's what we're aiming towards, and that's what we're trying to frame all of our activity around. It's enabling that subject matter expertise, that knowledge, that force structure knowledge, that capability knowledge, which really allows you as an operational lawyer to add a lot of value when giving your operational law advice.
Right. And so how do we get there, right? And this is, I think, what we kind of assessed right off the bat is, the need for this vision was critical in kind of structuring our efforts going forward. But then the secondary effort is, how do you get there? So now that we have this vision, we felt it was critical to start with some sort of process. Because if there's no process to enable that vision, then you lack direction. When you risk a lack of direction, therefore the foundation of that initial vision that you were trying to build potentially falls apart upon our ultimate transition. As we touched on earlier, that was part of the issue that we noticed in our initial assessment. The lack of continuity during transition processes or during transition. And the process itself kind of created the springboard to create continuity. So
yeah, because the idea is if you have a good process in place, you don't need necessarily personalities. You can maintain through people PCSing and being assigned to different places. It doesn't matter because you've got a process which is in place and hopefully survives the movement of personnel around our organizations.
That's right. And so with this understanding, we want to develop something that was accessible, that was direct, but comprehensive, so that it left room for two things: the critical quick wins to build that momentum, but also the opportunity to develop longer term projects to really kind of leverage and engage our, the creativity, the innovation, to kind of give us something that we could ultimately turn over at the end of our time there. Because I think if you kind of look at it from kind of a basic backwards planning perspective, knowing where we wanted to end up 2 years after we got here really kind of led us to this point where we could turn something over for the longer term for our replacements.
Exactly. So talking about the ends, ways and means, that the main ways that interoperability is improved are five main areas. One is doctrine and information management. The second is key leader engagement. The third is education. The fourth is training, and the fifth is exchanges.
And those are in order of priority. And so what I think is also really important to kind of note here is that, yes, Andy whiteboarded this. Yes, Andy and I had a lot of conversations about what this should look like, but we got a lot of consensus and we built a team. And then this working group team kind of looked at it and provided input. But then more importantly, in some ways, is we got then Brigadier General Berger, now our DJAG, involved, and my boss in the ALS, one-star Brigadier Keith Ebel, involved. And we got that senior leader investment in the process, providing that direction and guidance, which cemented the vision. The vision, by the way, we have it in front of us and we're looking at it, is accessible to anybody, and we can push it out. But it's prioritized, it's developed through consensus, and then overlay that with the senior leader engagement and the emphasis there really gave us that point where we could really get to work.
Yeah, and then essentially once we had managed to get that signed off at a senior level, really what that enabled was the activity. So more planning, longer time horizons to try and synchronize some of this activity. So going back to the sort of ends, ways and means, one of the things that we noticed when we first came into the roles was there wasn't really any legal interoperability doctrine. There was nothing that we could really put our hands on to say, this is super helpful from a legal perspective. There's lots of joint doctrine in terms of interoperability. There is interoperability Army doctrine, but nothing that was just specifically legal interoperability. And so over the course of about 8 months, the team here in the legal centre managed to be able to put the time aside to read into the topic and then to start building that. And so by the end of that 8-month period, we've now got legal interoperability doctrine, which is specifically written for legal advisors in mind, which is going to be built into the next FM 1-004, which is the legal support to military operations. That's Army doctrine. And also looking at the information management system. So there is a really good, and this is a plug for the APAN, which is the Allied All Partner Network. You can Google APAN and click on the link and apply for an account there. And that's really useful because it means that wherever you are in the world, you can get onto that portal, you can open up an account and you can share information up to official level, which is super helpful because the difficulty when you find with information sharing, which is a real impediment to interoperability, is either it's got to be unclassified and you basically just host it on a SharePoint somewhere that anybody can get hold of, or it's on protectively marked and secured information systems, which you need access to secure rooms and all that sort of stuff. But then there doesn't seem to be anything in between that. And so APAN is very useful because it does hit that sweet spot of being able to be opened from the internet, but you do go through a firewall, so you can hold information on there up to official level. So that was super helpful. In terms of the other documents which are really helpful for the Five Eyes community, the ABCAN's Coalition Operations Handbook. So that's the Australians, British, Canadians, New Zealanders, and American forces, the military forces, put together this really useful coalition handbook, which had a wholesale review and a significant rewrite about 4 or 5 months ago, which is a fantastic book, a handbook if you're going to deploy in operations within the coalition environment. It's a great handbook to get hold of.
Yes, and so going back to the process and the structure part of this, these products are intended and expected to be iteratively reviewed. So if we don't have, as exchange officers in our respective roles, if we don't have a process to look at this, you quickly become overwhelmed in the tyranny of the urgent. And so having the process, going through the review during our time doesn't mean that we're done. Doctrine, it's like your foxhole. You need to constantly improve it. And so now that the process is in place, and it is our line of effort number one, doctrine and information management, and we have this vision, now we get it turned over, and people are constantly looking at it, and we're making the updates, and we're furthering interoperability in that way because we're sharing the information, as Andy said. The other things that we have looked at as well, or what we feel as one of our big successes, is that interoperability is really permeating through our respective organizations. Our director of Army Legal Services is constantly being invited over to the U.S. to brief at the worldwide. There's the FEW Symposium that's coming up, and we're constantly interacting there. So the message of interoperability is coming down from those senior leaders and into our formations. Obviously, as you heard before, Major General Berger is directly involved in our efforts with Brigadier Keith Ebel, so that and we're working on efforts so that the cohort on both sides, receives the instruction and information that kind of informs them and instructs them around the importance of strengthening interoperability. These podcasts, for example, this is one of the really great opportunities that, thanks to the JAG Corps for making this available to us all. But this is how we spread the word. It gets out there, and people learn about interoperability. Andy and I, this is our second podcast, and people have listened to them. People that
maybe one or two, your mum, my mum.
Right. Well, they reach out and they talk to us, and I have gotten feedback from the field, thanking us both for really bringing this to the forefront and then explaining it in a way that is helpful to the field, because if we are not explaining it in a way that is accessible, then it's going to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. It's about spreading the word. It's also about reaching a level of sort of shared understanding as to how each nation works. What's their planning process? What's the role of the legal advisor in the various stages of that planning process? And it's also about, I think, reaching a level of understanding so that if you're talking about a given issue, you're using the same terminology, you're using the same jargon, if you like, so that you're actually, even though we're both speaking English, there are words in the British Army that are different in terms of meaning from the JAG Corps and the US Army. And so if you can get rid of those misunderstandings, it makes everything else much simpler in terms of reaching that shared understanding. And so legal interoperability. So throw a different question at you, Chris. Explain what legal interoperability is.
Sure. So, this is, in my mind, this is that relationship building, because as Andy had mentioned, right, there are differences in our language, right? And we're not talking about two people separated by a common language. We're talking about doctrinal terms of art that mean different things in both organizations. So, you look back on the exercises which are windows into why legal interoperability is important. And so if we were to use the recent warfighter exercise back in 2021 as an example, you start to understand that, where the British officers are talking about captured persons or CPERs, and the U.S. Army are talking about detainees. Well, the British Army looks at detainee in a certain way, whereas the U.S. Army is like, well, detainees are everything. to an extent. So there are these phrases that we're talking the same thing, but we're using different words. And therefore, if we can kind of move beyond that, or at least understand what we're talking about, then that initial shock of confusion can be avoided, and you don't then risk hindering the momentum that you're building.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also different interpretations on use of force. So whether that's self-defense, offensive force, whether that's the fact that you guys are mildly obsessed when it comes to fiscal law, which the British Army, thank the Queen, we don't have to deal with that particular bugbear. So there are lots of aspects to military legal practice which are different depending on which organisation you're from, and so it's crucial. This really all gets after that ability to operate alongside each other and essentially facilitate operational effectiveness of a coalition force. That's what legal interoperability really gets after. And law, I mean, I would say this because I'm an operational lawyer, but there are so many aspects of operational law that are relevant to military operations, whether that is detention on the battlefield, intelligence sharing, use of force, fiscal law issues, contracts, discipline. So there is so much that is nested within the practice of operational law that it's absolutely crucial that we are able to be interoperable, because if we're not, the chances that we allow our commanders to become interoperable is definitely hampered. And so that's why I think it's so crucial.
Absolutely. And so how do we then improve this shared understanding? How do we get after that? And so some of the efforts that Andy and I have advanced or been a part of advancing, we look at education and information sharing, information sharing being our number one line of effort, doctrine and information sharing, education being number three. But we have to understand that you can't build the relationships if you're not in the room together. I was at a course recently, and we had I was very fortunate to be there, and Harold Coe was speaking, and he drew a great metaphor. He's like, you can't be at the landing if you're not at the takeoff, right? And so we can't improve interoperability, we can't improve our shared understanding if we're not in the room together. And so that's why education is so important. So the ALS has recently developed the Senior Op Law course, and we just ran our pilot program, and we extended an invite over to the JAG Corps, and Brigadier General Allison Martin, commander of the Legal Center and School here, she traveled there. She traveled all the way to England to attend that course for several days and share that information with the ALS and build those relationships, because as our former TJAG said, you can't surge relationships. You have to be there together. Another example is the ALS is moving forward and really developing what they call the Intelligence and SEMA Law course. And so I had the privilege of attending that course back in November of 21. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I learned that was really like a stark contrast between what the ALS does and what the JAG Corps does is the involvement that the ALS has in domestic operations. We don't have that level of involvement in domestic operations in the U.S. Army JAG Corps, at least on the active duty side. And so kind of understanding the challenges and the issues faced in that arena really kind of helped me understand, why the ALS is constructed in the way that it is, what it's looking at. And so then that's how we build that shared understanding, is being in the room together and seeking out these opportunities to join in education and training and learning.
Yeah, because actually part of it is you can be individually interoperable, but what we're trying to achieve is that institutional interoperability. So moving it from being a number of individuals who are able to go into other forces and operate alongside allies and partners, and moving it from the individual to the institution. So you've got so many people who are interoperable that actually largely the organizations can work really well alongside each other. And that's all nested in, from the Army perspective, the Army Staff Talks, which was another thing that we were involved with, which was essentially the Army, at the Army level, the 4-star level, trying to build interoperability across weapons platforms, across capabilities, so that we can harness each other's strengths going out the door as part of a coalition. So it's actually just increasing all of those linkages is the aim. But it wasn't all plain sailing, Chris, was it? So it's good, I think, we own our failures. And so I think in terms of extreme ownership, I'm a Jocko Willink guy, extreme ownership, going through the failures where through almost recce by fire, we stumbled into some things that were going to be so difficult that they weren't worth investing in, and then some things that we tried that actually weren't as good as we thought they were going to be. So there were a few things that I think it's fair to say that we didn't move the ball along as far as we would have liked. One of those was that we would like to have done short pulse exchanges, so identifying individuals who can go to other countries for a short period of time, sort of under 3 months, in order to try and get the same experience or a concentrated form of experience that we've been getting from going to another country and being embedded within a different team. But that actually, from a funding perspective, was a nightmare. And the reason why we can easily move within our program is because it's an established program with established funding streams associated to it. And one of the difficulties in short pulse exchanges is you'd have to go on TDY essentially. So your unit continues to pay for you. It's very expensive. And the losing unit is thinking, well, what is the unit? If you're a divisional commander, you're thinking, well, what am I getting in return for that? The sort of improvement in that one individual is at the cost of maybe other things that they're wanting to do because it is so expensive. And so that was one of the things that I think we identified as not necessarily doable in the immediate term.
That's right. And another one that I have really taken to heart in terms of failing in my initial mission was to create a more formal structure to exploit the opportunities in collective training. So I'll just put it out there. I am a process person. I love processes. I love structure. It just like soothes me to have predictability.
I thank the gods, Chris, because if you didn't, then we would have been in a complete mess.
And so I will say that this is probably one of the things that I will look back on and ask myself after I've had some time to reflect on this position is how come I didn't do this thing better? And what I mean by that is there are so many collective training opportunities out there. We are always training NTC, JRTC, JMRC on the UK side, all of the exercises I'm doing at the Salisbury Plain, moving over to Germany and exercising at Senelager, et cetera. And so how do we ensure that we get judge advocates into UK-led exercises? How do we get ALS officers into the U.S.-led exercises? There's willingness there. There's eagerness to do this. But on the ALS side in particular, there's a fourth generation challenge. The ALS is about 112 personnel strong. And so when you're talking about taking 2% of your total workforce out of the net, it is a significant emotional impact for that legal office that's losing these high quality individuals for not just the 2 weeks of training, but you want to send them there a little bit early so they can get acclimatized. When on their way back, they've got to take maybe some leave or maybe work on product so that we can share the good word. So it's a challenge and it's tough and it's a risk reward analysis. And so that fourth generation process on the ALS side, which by the way is not controlled by the director, we have to work hand in hand with our operating units.
That's one of the other big differences.
Right.
Is TJAG has his tasking authority, so he can basically just turn to Major X and say, hey, you've got to come out of Korea tomorrow and I'm sending you to Hawaii, whereas our DALS doesn't have that tasking authority, and so it's a big difference.
That's absolutely right. And so you have to coalition build, you have to build teams, and you got to get people to invest, and unfortunately I was not able to crack that nut. One of the other things that we talked about really wanting to do, as Andy had mentioned and alluded to earlier, is that that institutional advancement of interoperability. We wanted to make bespoke, I understand that's a British term, but basically unique, tailored interoperability courses at our training schools, if you will. So at the JAG school, like a course solely on interoperability, and the ALS having a course delivered to the ALS that was purely on interoperability. And I'll let Andy take that one.
Yeah, so I think the idea behind that would be that you would have a bespoke course where where you would have students come and they would be taught on, for example, all of the issues that I've mentioned that impact on the battlefield, whether that's detainee handling, whether that's intelligence sharing, whether that's SEMA, whether that is use of force, whether that's escalation of force. All of these topics would be broken out and essentially taught from two different perspectives, one on one nation, one on the other. So you understand not only your own national positions on these topics, but you'd also get the position and the legal position from the other nation. But the difficulty with that is that for institutions like the legal centre and school, they've got a very, very packed curriculum already. And so what we aspire to do is to feed interoperability issues into all of those courses that are already being run. And actually that's where you want to get to in terms of interoperability, that it's not just a thing on its own, but actually it's part of all of the subject matter of all of the courses that you run. And so that's just a time-intensive job, which is to go through all of the curriculum and to weave interoperability in through all of those courses. So that's just a time issue.
That's right. I mean, the logistical challenge in developing a course, we learned very quickly. I mean, that's a full-time job in and of itself that would take maybe a year or more. And not only that, but there are other requirements. There are essentially assurance requirements, right? So in the UK, it's DSAT, right? You have to have it DSAT compliant. And how do you get there? And that takes a lot of time. Here at the JAG School, you've got to go through an accreditation program if you're going to have a course delivered in that manner. And so I guess to use a trite term, I mean, the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. And so although a failure in quotes, I think that what we did instead was kind of redirect our energy and start to, like, as Andy was saying, weave interoperability topics into existing courses. And that's not to say that there is no space for a bespoke course, but maybe that's just for a different team sometime down the road.
Somebody who's like way more bright and capable than me, for sure. So in terms of the failures, we've gone through the failures, and I think now in terms of talking about what's next. So I leave the States in the end of July. It's been an amazing 2 years, and hopefully doing a little bit of travel to Hawaii to meet up with Chris, who will be flown in with his family to Hawaii and set up shop. So I'm hoping to share a beer on the beach at some point. But before all that happens, in terms of what next, we've had the exchange officer working group earlier today, and the idea behind that was to build a forum for exchange officers wherever they are in the world, as somewhere that they can discuss issues, they can identify opportunities or events or exercises or training courses that are happening in their area, so that we can identify where we might be able to do stuff alongside each other and take hold of those opportunities. So that was the Exchange Officer Working Group earlier today, and we had about 12, 15 people on that, and I'm hoping that can be used as a forum that widens the net a little bit, because obviously, Chris, you and I talk about interoperability on a daily basis, but it's a very sort of siloed conversation. And so what we're trying to do is just open the aperture more widely and include more people in the conversation, and so hopefully be able to build that institutional interoperability that we spoke about earlier.
That's absolutely right. That is one of the initiatives that I think, although it came on towards the end, very proud of. I mean, we had people from all over the globe attend this meeting today, and thank you to them for staying up late or getting up early. I mean, it was a really valuable opportunity. The other thing that I think really happy to turn over to our replacements is further work to strengthen formalization. I think that this is, just by virtue of the nature of our positions, it is and will likely remain a challenge, and therefore we must always be at the forefront of these efforts. In the final months, Andy and I, we will conduct our final steering group. This is our key leader engagement. So General Berger and Brigadier Keith will get together, and they're going to give us kind of that transitional guidance. So outgoing team to the new incoming team, so that they have some clear goals that they can take up right away and just move out on, and which kind of cements that senior leader emphasis and endorses the efforts that we have kind of undertaken,
And it approves the planning. Yeah, it does. And it approves the planning out 24 months, because the difficulty that you identify with interoperability, one of the main problems is once you've left a job which interoperability was fundamentally part of your role, is that you atrophy really quickly. And so even though you were able to deploy on operations in a coalition, within about 2 years, your ability to instantly go back into that situation is degraded significantly, and you require more training, more exercises in order to bring you back up to speed. And I think one of the key lessons that we've learned sort of painfully is you have to be constantly moving just to stand still. And that requires a level of planning and engagement and synchronizing all of these activities just literally to stay still. So I think one of the key it will be to make sure that we maintain that momentum but widen the aperture so there are more people involved and more people engaged, hopefully, in all of the different activities that we've spoken about earlier, so that we further that institutional interoperability.
And the other thing that I would say in terms of what's next is I think that Andy and I, or our positions, we can't keep this momentum on our own, and in order to really kind of see the benefit or validate the purpose of what we've been doing in terms of bringing formal structure and processes to the table, we really want to see that tactical level engagement, that structural, that institutional interoperability. And so we commend to our successors, them kind of pushing that message out and saying, hey, let's form linkages from office to office. You don't have to come to me if you want to talk to X office about, Y opportunity. Just keep me informed, keep me in the loop, because that tactical level integration, that's where those relationships are going to be built, and that's what's really going to carry this forward.
And also the processes, I think, survive changes in personality. And
that's
so
right.
If you build in formal processes and meetings and working groups, it just means that people can PCS and be posted and assigned, but you've still got that framework around which people know what the aim of those groups are, and they have an opportunity to contribute and to maintain that momentum.
Absolutely. So now that we've kind of are starting to wrap up our 2 years here, Andy, what would you say are some of your key takeaways? What have you learned in this position?
Gosh, I've learned a lot. Essentially, I think one of the most important things, and this is nothing that's sort of rocket science, but relationships are absolutely crucial. And what that means is you've got to take the time to spend with people, learning about them, what their background is, where they come from, making sure that you can understand what capabilities they can bring to the fight, if you like, so that you're not asking people in sort of coalition operation perspective. You're not asking them to do things that they can't do because they don't have the command authority to do it, or they don't have the capability to do that. You understand that because you've discussed that beforehand, and anything that you think will impact upon that, you've already got out in the open. So I think relationships are absolutely crucial. I think the second thing is, because we are in hierarchical organizations, the senior leadership engagement is absolutely fundamental, because guess what? If a senior leader is interested in something, everyone's interested in it, or at least you can make other people be interested in it. So I think the senior leader engagement has been absolutely fundamental, and I think General Berger and Brigadier Abel have been absolutely brilliant in giving us all the support that we needed in order to open doors or to get resources unlocked. So senior leader engagement is crucial. And I think the final thing I'd say is the opportunities out there for interoperability are super fun. Not only are they fun, but you learn an absolute ton, and you meet people that maybe are going to be friends for a long time, and contacts that you can reach out to in the future. So it's enormous amounts of fun. And if you can make the interoperability activity not necessarily about the event. So let's say you go on we went down to Fort Hood to do Warfighter. Part of the time we spent there was rewriting the ABCAN's coalition handbook based on what we were doing during the day. And so you end up building these products that stand the test of time, at least for the next 6 months, 2 years, and be iteratively improved. So you're leaving something that is able to be used and help other people along. So I think just how much fun it is, and if you have the opportunity to go on exercise, or go on an exchange, or go to a course, whether that's in America or whether that's in San Remo or whether that's in the UK, wherever that is, just to seize those opportunities, because it's just a load of fun, and you meet some ace people, you learn some great stuff, and you hopefully building that legal institutional interoperability as you go along.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all of that. I think that for me, I hope my replacement, Lieutenant Colonel Justin Freeland, sees it this way when he gets into position. But I have learned that there is a need to hand over something with clear goals.
You could actually literally hand him over a skeleton in the closet because he's taking over your house, isn't he?
Yes, that's right. Taking over the house and the cars. It's almost as
high
if
things around the house.
That's right. This is how we maintain momentum. But as we discussed, Andy and I learned very early on the importance of having a long-term plan, and so we hope that, as far as that goes, we made progress. We hope that we've left something tangible for our replacements to take up and move out on. We hope that what we have done has provided some clear direction, and we hope that they build on this foundation. I would also say that one of the other points that I learned, and it's probably no surprise because, as I mentioned, I'm a process person, but it is really, really critical, and I know we've hit this ad nauseum, but it's process. Interoperability is really complex, and I really do believe that it can get easily mired in personal initiative, and so we have to kind of fight against that and do our best to bring others along so that we can all invest into what I consider a mutually supportive effort.
Awesome. And on that bombshell, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for taking the time to do the podcast, and looking forward to seeing you in Hawaii on a beach with a beer.
Absolutely. Thanks, brother.
Take care.
Are you an operational law judge advocate or civilian professional? If you are interested in participating in the Battlefield Next podcast, we invite you to reach out on tjaglcs.army.mil/FCD. We are always on the lookout for the next conversation to prepare the JAG Corps and sister service legal services for the next fight. For the Center for Law and Military Operations, thank you for joining us on Battlefield Next.